All right. Now, one incremental concern that has come up is the potential of a weak monsoon. Now, typically, conventional wisdom says you have a weak monsoon, the direct impact flows through onto the FMCG sector. But how are things looking right now? How direct does the correlation end up being? Joining us to help us understand that better, Sunil Duggal of Dabur India, CEO of Dabur India. Mr. Duggal, very good afternoon to you, sir. Thank you so much for making a little bit of time for us. Let me just start by, let me ask you how things are looking right now. We'll get into sort of second guessing the monsoon in a minute, but as things stand right now, what's the environment on the ground, sir, for you?
At the moment, things are looking all right. We've had a good run in the last few months. The demand side seems fairly robust, and the margin profile is also improving. So far so good. Then, as you said, the remaining part of the year would be significantly dependent upon the monsoon and the attendant rural economy growth.
Ms. Duggal, how sensitive do sales tend to be to the monsoon right now? I'm asking that question in the context that, over the last couple of years or so, you have seen a little bit of, incremental rural sector income come from non-agriculture related activities such as NREG, etc. I'm just wondering if, the correlation between a weak monsoon and FMCG sales has come off at all?
No, there's a strong correlation. I think what happened, say, around 5 years ago was there was a huge dose of stimuli which came into the rural markets, which fueled demand over the last 4 or 5 years. Now that story has, we believe, has been significantly played out. So further demand impetus will have to come from a good agri crop, which is of course contingent upon a good monsoon. So I think the criticality of a good monsoon is a little bit higher than what it was, say, 3, 4, 5 years ago. You would remember in 2007, 2008, we had actually a very poor monsoon, but still the demand side was good because of the stimuli. But assuming that more stimuli will not be pumped in, more such doles, etc., like NREGA limits won't be increased. If that happens and there is a poor monsoon, then we do have a little bit of demand constraint, which we would expect.
So that's interesting. So you're actually saying that, for instance, if we do get to a scenario as bad as the last time we had a deficient monsoon, then this time around the potential downside on FMCG companies on volume, firstly, could be far steeper?
I believe so. I may be wrong here, but I think what happened in 2007 is a little bit different than what is happening now. I think the government at that point in time had more flexibility in providing stimuli to the rural markets, and perhaps the hands are a little bit tied now, so I don't expect the same level to operate this year. So therefore the criticality of monsoon is high.
That's a very important point you're making. So, that's on the demand side, in terms of just, the output, the agricultural incomes, and then what it translates into on the demand end. How is the inflation story playing out on rural demand? Because, even if you get an okay monsoon, but inflation continues and, we've seen food inflation once again rise, how is that going to play out in the volumes, sir, from here on?
High inflation normally doesn't impact demand. I think the bigger problem for us would be high inflation in input costs leading to high price increases, and that in a sense would be a further dampener to demand. But we've seen the consumer is pretty used to high single-digit inflation now, and doesn't seem to kill his appetite for buying non-discretionary products such as ours. But high input costs is something which would worry me a little bit more.
So I'll come to the input cost side in a minute. There was a call from an influential broker just a couple of days back, and their premise was that all through last year, when every other part of the economy was doing, badly, the consumption side held up, particularly the consumer staples side. And their assumption was that, it can't hold on indefinitely. Yeah. Something will crack, and on top of that, if you get a bad monsoon, it could crack quite steeply and quite quickly. Would you, agree with that? Would you counter that view, sir?
I would tend to disagree, because this is not a very volatile sector. So even in a bad year, the growth could drop from, let's say, low double digits to maybe mid-teens, kind of mid-single-digit growth. So it won't be anything catastrophic. We don't see any demand turning into negative territory under any circumstances. So the worst-case scenario is the demand will drop down to, let's say, 5-6% from the current level of maybe 10 to 12%. And that's about the worst we can get, because these products do have a certain traction, and the growth is something which is very visible and very sustainable.
So what's your base case scenario, sir, for volume growth for the year?
Well, we are hoping for 10% volume growth, and it is of course contingent upon a host of factors such as a reasonable monsoon, maybe not a great monsoon, but at least a reasonable one, lowering levels of inflation and consequent lower input costs. So if this happens, then I think a 10% volume growth is what we should seek from our domestic business.
Got that. So now coming to the input cost side, are there sort of pressures that are starting to re-emerge, or are things more or less under control on the input cost side?
So far so good. The things are under control and we haven't seen any spike in any materials. But having said that, you never know how things are going to be going forward. So I think it's probably a good time to cover some commodities and buy on a low cycle, because there is a possibility of inflation reviving.
And the currency, at least for the components that you would need to import, a bit of sort of an additional negative point?
Yeah, not a very serious one, fortunately. Most of our commodities are sourced from within the country. There are some areas like beverages where there is a high import content, but it's still not more than 10% of our total input costs.
Got that. So is there any potential for margin improvement then, on the assumption that there's no spike on the input cost side?
I think so. We are seeing gradual margin improvement, and I do expect a little bit more of that to happen, and which could actually become a fairly significant margin improvement if the monsoon were to get its act back. So the margin outlook does seem to be fairly benign this year, at least compared to last year, where the inflation levels were extraordinarily high.
All right, got that. So just a quick word on how things are going across your international portfolios. What's the picture there? Any sort of change over the last few months, 6 odd months?
I think the businesses there are doing well, particularly the Middle Eastern, North African business, which has now turned around because of much lower input costs, and also revival of business in markets such as Libya, which were pretty much shut down last year. So the MENA business, which is at the epicenter of our international operations, is actually going to have a pretty good year. Their supply chain is denominated in dollars, so they don't have any currency issues. Inflation levels are extraordinarily low there, and the demand side seems to be holding up. I think the only exposure which we have is Egypt, where the political issues might have some impact on business. But other than Egypt, everything else seems to be under control.
Would you say it's a good time to look for more sort of assets there? Any thought being given along those lines, sir?
I think one should be a little circumspect in buying assets during these times of volatility. And the risk factor does appear a little bit high in terms of any asset buyout. So we'll be looking at something which is contiguous to our areas of business in terms of both portfolio and geographies, which can be bolted on with very low levels of risk, rather than look for something very expansionary in nature. I think it's a time to be circumspect till the global economic situation becomes a little bit better.
Fair enough. So just one last question, back home. You've had some reorganization on the distribution side all through last year. How's that playing out, sir? Are there sort of direct benefits that could accrue from there, sir?
Very well. Yes, we are seeing benefits on the ground, and this volume growth of 10%, which I spoke about, probably would not have happened had we not undergone that distribution reorg. So a lot of it is now behind us, but we have to do a little bit more on the rural front. Some states have not yet been covered under the rural drive. So once that is done, I think we would have a far stronger presence in rural India with a wider array of products and a more profitable mix.
And so even on the advertising side, there's been talk about increased ad spends. What's that about? Is there a specific sort of linkage there?
Yeah, I think we are going back to the levels which were there 2 years ago. Last year we did cut back advertising to some extent because of very high input costs, and we chose not to pass on the entire increase in input cost to the consumer, but we cut back on advertising to some extent. Now that is undergoing a change. We are resurrecting our spends considerably, so we would be looking at far more aggressive A&P spend this year. Unless, of course, inflation again becomes extremely high and we are again constrained to cut back on A&P to some extent.
All right, so just as a last question, it's been wonderful talking to you because these days everybody we speak to in corporate India, there's, a high level of tension and concern about the economic scenario. You're looking wonderfully calm and confident about how the year would play out for your industry and you, sir.
Well, we are fortunate to be in this sector where the volatility is low, so we don't suffer the same levels of tension as many of our colleagues do in other businesses. But there are pressures, and I wouldn't like to minimize those. And whether it's the inflation issues or demand side or the monsoon effect. So these are difficult times, but I think this is a sector which is better equipped than others to ride out the rough edges.
All right, got that, sir. I'll leave it at that. Have a great afternoon. Thanks so much indeed for taking some time for us. That's Sunil Dugal, CEO of Dabur. So I think, for all of those naysayers who are waiting for, consumer staples, FMCG to crack, at least Mr. Dugal seems relatively confident that things are okay for now. A quick break. We'll come back with a conversation with Gerard Lyons. He's